Hi, I'm Amberlee and I'm here to talk to you today about recovery as part of the Falmouth Repair Illustration Forum. So I'll start with an introduction to me. I'm a mental health advisor. I've been working in higher education institutes for about 6 years now. I'm based at a mental health team at UAL. And I've also worked in the NHS, I've worked in non-profits in the past as well, but mostly have spent my career working in mental health in higher education, supporting students with complex mental health needs, but also training and supporting staff as well to support students. My background is in mental health. I have a master's in clinical psychiatry from UAL, and it's always something that has kind of fed through a lot of the work that I've done. And as I kind of go through the rest of the things that I'm doing, hopefully it will make clearer how everything works together. So I'm also an illustrator. I founded my illustration studio Line and Honey about 3 years ago now. I mostly focus on illustration commissions for brands that share the same values as I. All of my work is really focused on black women and depicting black women in soft spaces and reflective spaces, and I work a lot with brands who are also trying to include that in their branding and visuals. So I create illustrations for them, and I also create art pieces, illustration pieces for the home as well. In terms of research, I just published a research paper in the Journal of Illustration with a colleague that looks at black women and representation and wellness. Lots of links and parallels to the things that we'll be talking about today. And lastly, I work as a facilitator and educator. I do lots of mental health training and workshops and things, and I'm currently working as an associate lecturer on a cultural and historical studies course whilst I complete the academic practice postgrad certificate. So lots of different things that I'm doing. I've always done a lot of different things, and all of the things that I'm currently working on and doing that I've just kind of introduced, they all kind of form the basis of what I'm talking about with you today. And as we kind of go through the content, hopefully it will be clearer what my positionality is and how I approach my work and illustration as well. So what do I propose? Where do I stand and what am I proposing today? So all of the work that I've just kind of introduced to you really briefly has really just this year kind of slotted itself in together. So it's always been really complementary. Everything I've done has always worked really complementary with each other. But actually it's just in the last year or so that they've really started to fit together well and to work with each other. And that is what has built the foundation of my approach to illustration, my approach to my mental health work, and it's exactly what I'm going to be talking with you about today. How do the things that I focus on, intersectionality, wellness, mental health, how do these things relate to each other? And I guess most importantly, how do they relate to illustration and our creative practices? So it's my view, it's my kind of approach that it's the responsibility of an illustrator to use their medium to communicate intersectionality, the nuances of your identity. And for me, the main reason why is recovery. Everything I do is in a bid to head towards recovery. And recovery is a massive term. There's so much that we can talk about there. So we will kind of talk about what I mean when I say recovery in this space. So to begin, we will look at a few keywords. It feels really important to me that we start with a few shared definitions of the words that we are going to be talking about a lot today, just so that we know that we're singing from the same song sheet, basically, because these recovery, the first word that we're looking at, it's a massive, massive concept. It's something that we see a lot in everyday life in various ways. And for me today, when I talk about recovery, I'm actually talking about recovery in the clinical sense, in a mental health sense. So I'm thinking about recovery in regards to how we use it in healthcare, in the NHS, how we use it nationally when we're approaching mental health and supporting individuals. And it's funny because recovery has, I think it traditionally looks at the cure. It looks at having an ailment, having something that's wrong, and recovery is the understanding that the thing that was wrong, the ailment you have, a broken leg for example, is cured, you have recovered, it is now no longer something that you have. And this is a really traditional view. This is really old school. It isn't the way that we approach recovery in mental health today. So this quote, this excerpt that I have here is taken from a white paper published back in 2008, but still really, really applicable today, by a few public health professionals aligned with the NHS and the Centre for Mental Health. And it really explores how, the title of the white paper is Making Recovery a Reality. And it really explores what does recovery mean on a more person-centred individual basis. So as it says here, recovery is a set of values that gives light to a person's right to build a meaningful life for themselves. And that is with or without a continuing presence of mental health symptoms. So what that means is that whether or not your mental health symptoms or experiences exist, what recovery talks about is the meaningful life that you build for yourself around that. So when we look at the aspects of recovery, we're looking at things such as independence, we're looking at things such as peer support and community, we're looking at things such as future-oriented thinking and goals and where you see yourself in your careers and vocations. These are all aspects of recovery, and when we're asking someone what recovery means to them, we're asking them, what does a meaningful life look like for you? What would you like to happen where you then feel that you are well and in a good space? So it's based on ideas of self-determination and self-management as well. And what's really important is that it emphasises hope. Hope is at the centre of recovery. Hope is something that should always be brought up when we're talking about recovery, because it's what sustains motivation, it's what keeps us going, and importantly, it also helps manage our expectations of what we define as an individually fulfilled life. And there's so much here, there's so much that we could unpack here if we had more time, but there's a lot here that is going to apply directly to my position in terms of illustration, but also as I ask us to think together about how you might incorporate recovery into your work and your illustration as well. So the next key word that we are thinking through together is intersectionality. So intersectionality is a fairly new term. It was coined in 1989, and it basically highlights that there is no social identity or category of identity that exists in isolation of others. So it acknowledges the various layers that contribute to the identity of one person. So it was coined, as I said, in 1989 by a lawyer and activist, Kimberly Crenshaw, and she coined this in response to the structural inequality that saw black women at the time basically the subject of inequity twice over, one for being a woman and two for being black. So it kind of brings together the complex existence of any one person and acknowledges the various layers that's included to contribute to you being you. So of course it is really central to highlighting inequality and injustice, but it's also really important in us identifying our own position in society and actually the uniqueness of what we bring to each situation. Intersectionality plays a massive part in my work, in my illustration work, and I also think a lot about duality and how duality kind of lends itself to intersectionality as well, and that will be something that we bring up a lot throughout today. So these keywords, as I said, in the kind of further reading list, there's a further reading list that I will share with you, and I'll make sure that I include these references and kind of links to further reading as well, so that you can read around all of the things that I'll introduce today, because I know that in the time we have, I might be kind of introducing things quite quickly. So I will provide that resource list, so there's always places that you can go if you're interested in reading a bit more about it. Okay, so how will I be looking at illustration? What are we looking at today? Exploring the key is exploring how illustration can be used as a tool or a vehicle for recovery. And what I'll do is I'm actually going to separate this into 4 kind of pillars, the kind of main approaches to how I look at my illustration, how I approach my work. And I'll be looking as well throughout at how important representation of black illustrators and illustrators of colour are in everything that we're talking about today. So, as I said, I'll spread it into, or I'll kind of categorise it into 4 main areas, 4 main approaches, and I'll be exploring all of this from my position as a black woman, and I'll be bearing my intersectionality in mind. At the end, I will pose a few questions for you to take forward as you continue to think about your work and your creative practice, so that you can think about how this might apply to your illustration going forwards. Okay, so I am going to kind of talk through 3 examples that I have here of amazing illustrators. I am aware that this format is probably not the best format to engage with these kind of references, so I won't delve too deeply into them. I will introduce them, introduce the illustrators, and actually I'll bring these to the workshop that I'm running as part of this forum on Friday the 5th of March. I'll bring these references and a few more so that we can all kind of engage in this together and maybe think through how you feel kind of looking at it and what your thoughts are, what comes to mind. So I'll introduce them now, and then we'll talk about them and engage with them in a further depth in the workshop at the end of the week. So this first example here is by a graphic studio called Wild Logic, and the work, the outcome of this studio is a lot of really wonderful, joyful pieces, really beautiful colours. The illustrator behind this studio also plays around a lot with typography, and there's a lot of meaning that comes across in the work that's created here. So yeah, really joyful examples, really bright. I think the wellness kind of comes throughout this piece already, just by looking at it. So the second piece here is by a really wonderful illustrator, Joy Yamasagi. And their work is a really wonderful representation of, it's been said in an interview that it's to really reflect their beliefs and their experiences personally and culturally. And this artist is a multidisciplinary artist, so illustration, art, mark making, really wonderful pieces, often large scale. That says a lot about blackness and our experiences. So a really wonderful reference to look at. There's an interview with this artist and Yellow Zine that I'll put in the reference list to look out for as well, so you've got further space to read. This last illustration is by a really wonderful illustrator that I came across on Instagram, and there's a lot of typography, a lot of kind of comic style illustrations here, and they use comedy and humour to speak on blackness and everyday experiences, including injustice, but in a really light, comedic way. And honestly, it's such a joy to look through. I would really recommend going through this Instagram account. I'll put all the references in the list, as I said, so you can have a look. But really, really interesting ways of exploring blackness and our experiences using humour as well. So as I said, definitely have a look at the reference further reading list, but also bring some of your thoughts to the workshop if you are attending, so that we can talk about it further together. So I've also included some of my work here as well. So these are a few illustrations created over the course of maybe a couple of years. So the last illustration on this page I created a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, and actually the first 2 were created during the lockdown period. So the work that I create is very mindful, minimal design, as I said, always focused or centred on black women. And I guess my work has 3 main intentions. The first is to show up for women of colour, is to show that we're visible. All of the work I create is often women at home or in kind of soft, neutral environments. I often draw women with their plants and with kind of soft interiors around them. And this is reflective of what I'm drawn to. The second aim is to create or produce a soothing, mindful experience for the viewer, for the person that's kind of interacting with my work and engaging with it. And these two things, the two aims I've mentioned, they come together for the last aim, and potentially the most important aim, which is to shed light on the more softer sides of women of colour, and to celebrate the versions and aspects of us that aren't often seen. So all of my illustrations are utilising a very neutral colour palette. Everything I create really lends itself well to what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking at the time, but also to the stories that I want to tell. So if we dive right in, this is, I guess, the first of the 4 ways that I'm exploring how we can use illustration as a tool for recovery. So how are we using illustration to provide hope for change? So I guess to look at this, we have to go all the way back and kind of delve right back into illustration historically. So illustration has always been powerful. It's powerful now, and we know that. All of us, hopefully, I assume, are kind of aligned with illustration in some way. But illustration has always been really powerful and often shaped society. So I'm thinking back to early newspapers, early adverts, before kind of photography, for example, was heavily utilised. Illustration was often used to help to complement adverts and newspapers and media back in the day. And you know, if and when black figures were included in this format, it was often in derogatory or subservient positions. It was often reflective of how black people were viewed in society at the time, but also by illustrating black people and people of colour in this way, it also perpetuated this view, this opinion of black people, and kind of solidified that stereotype over the years. And a really interesting example of that actually is the illustrations that accompany the Uncle Tom's Cabin story. So this story was first published back in 1850s, and it told the story of a slave and the relationship that this slave built with a young girl, Eva, a really friendly, caring, nurturing relationship that this slave built with this child in the family. And it's such a complex example because this story aimed to be a anti-racist story. So basically, by using quite racist narratives and a really racist story, ultimately, the moral of that was to act as an anti-racist and to highlight what was wrong with slavery at the time. It was heavily illustrated. There was illustrations throughout, and interest. I mean, there's such a complex example, and there's so much that we could talk about here. But basically, over the years, from 1852, over the years, there were various iterations and formats of this book. The book continued to be developed and rewritten. The illustrations continued to change and to evolve. And what started as supposedly an anti-racist story ended up being extremely damaging to the views and opinions of black people. And as the illustrations continued to be recreated over the years, the illustrations became more and more derogatory. And actually the illustrators at the time and the authors continued to reflect their view of black people in the illustration, and what started as anti-racist actually ended up perpetuating a really complex, negative stereotype of this kind of Uncle Tom figure. And actually it was the illustration and the narratives of this book that shaped that over the years. There is a really wonderful photo essay about this from the University of Virginia that basically lays out the entire process of the Uncle Tom's Cabin story and the illustrations, most importantly, that accompanied it over the years as it was reiterated on stage, in plays. So much to say. I've added that to the further reading list, and I would definitely recommend kind of taking some time, getting some tea, sitting down and reading through the really complex development of the Uncle Tom's Cabin story. And actually, all of that is to say how powerful it was, how much it shaped societal views, not only by reflecting it, but actually by shaping and continuing to shape views as we went through the years. So the work we make today, looking at a parallel between how we started, how illustration started years ago, and what we're making today, it holds the same power to tell and change narratives, producing work from a place of progress and hope. Now, for me, there feels like a really clear role for archives, object-based learning, documentation. This image here is a flyer for a conference run by the Black Panthers back in 1971. This conference was held, and the Black Panther archive that I've taken this from is a really thorough, in-depth archive by Shades of Noir. They have a really wonderful artifact space online where they have documented lots and lots, I want to say up to 20 plus Black Panther newsletters. And this archive is from the Black Panther UK party, which is really wonderful because there isn't much documentation of the Black Panther party here in England. And that archive gives rise to highlights a lot of the stories they were telling at the time, a lot of the news that was being told by members of the Black Panther Party. Really, really rich material there for you to look at. And this conference poster has an illustration showing various people of colour from various nationalities, various religions, holding hands, and the aim is towards unity. That's the kind of subheading here, and the theme of the conference that they held in Alexandra Palace, Ali Pali, back in 1971. And this is an example of how important, how central archives were to the documentation of illustration, creativity, what was happening at the time. But I would say also gives rise to how central and important archives are to the present day. I think, I've put here, I know it's in really small words, but I've put here that documentation equals permanence. And actually, all of the illustrations and work that we're creating today are artifacts that are reflecting the times that we are currently in and the people that shape it. And the work that we're creating now deserves to be documented. The narratives that we tell through the work that we make will be documented and looked at as we kind of go forward. We will be looking back at this time as an understanding of what was happening around the time that we're in, but also who was there, who was visible around that time. So really heavily linked to that is, how do we use illustration to contribute or reclaim our narratives? How do we decide how Black people are presented in illustration? So when we are dealing with history, we've just had a bit of a brief look at illustration historically, and when we're dealing with that, we're looking at how much bias there was in the depiction of Black people in ways that only served the majority. So this image that I have here is an excerpt from a symposium, the Crisis Journal, which was an academic journal published over about potentially a century. I will check and add this to the reference to the resource list that I'll send across. But the Crisis Journal was a really wonderful academic journal written by African Americans, by Black Americans, and this particular issue was from 1926, and W.E.B. Du Bois posed 7 questions in a symposium challenging this idea of our narratives and who decides how we're presented in illustration, in creativity, in the work that was being produced at the time. And he basically says that, is it fair that the only stories that are told about Black people are told either to push or to continue to push a societal view of Black people at the time, or only uninteresting and positive stories were ignored often ignored in preference for stories that were derogatory and highlighted us in a really negative way. So all of the day-to-day uninteresting narratives of black people, all of the positive things that were happening at the time were completely ignored in order to contribute to a very specific narrative for what they wanted to be told at the time. We are now in a space where we can potentially create works that are completely opposite to that and are representative of who we are and exactly what stories we want to tell in order to own our narratives. And this is after decades of narratives being told around us or about us that either were not based in reality or that completely ignored the positive parts of us that contribute so largely to our experiences. Now, there is another point, I guess a complete opposite point to this idea of who decides, and it's looking at the economy and capitalism, because that, of course, when we speak about the art world and we speak about the illustration, but the art industry much in a more wider perspective, capitalism plays a massive part in that. And there is a really interesting paper actually on the economy, and it looks at the economy of African art and how money and the sale of art pieces of African art by black artists, how money contributes to the stories that we feel able to tell. So it references, for example, art sales by Sotheby's, for example, and pieces by artists like Basquiat that sold for millions, basically. And it basically looks at and challenges this and says that as artists, we're all trying to make it. We're all trying to make it in our industry. We're all trying to make it as an artist and be a successful artist. But to what extent are we allowed to create the narratives that we want to tell if our success is being dictated by what art collectors and the art industry are buying? If we're only able to create the things that we know would be desirable to galleries, for example, or collectors that we want to purchase our work, to what extent are we completely free to make what we want to make? And it's interesting because we're looking at early illustration and how we were depicted by majority white illustrators, and how over the years we've started to reclaim our narrative and create work for ourselves that tells the stories that we want to tell. But now that we are in that position to make this, we're now looking at other ways of control and controlling the narrative, where we're looking at money and how much that contributes to the work that we want to make. There's so much to talk about there as well. I'll put the paper in the reference list. I think it's a much bigger conversation, capitalism and the art world and people of colour and representation. There is so much that could be discussed there as well, lots of juicy things to talk about, but also much more complex conversations that could potentially have a whole lecture within itself. But I will put that paper in the list so that you can start there potentially and read further into that topic. So I'm thinking about both opposing views there, which is looking at who decides, who contributes to our narrative, and if it is us, how much control do we have over what we tell? And I guess what I'm saying is that there is an opportunity here to level the playing field a little and introduce new ideas that I would go as far as to say aren't new in our experiences, but are new to illustration and to visual arts. I think a lot of the narratives centred around joy and community and wellness are actually age-old rituals and processes that have been in our community for years. There's a lot of cultures, there's a lot of people of colour that when they think about their background and different intersections of their identity, think about how much community and wellness plays a massive part in that. But those stories haven't always been told. We don't know much about, or we don't get to see much of our wellness and recovery and ability to be with each other in our works as much as we could. And it feels like this is a really wonderful time to create work that is telling these stories right now. I am aware that I've said a lot about the history of representation. Actually, it paints a bit of a bleak picture, I think. I think it's rooted a lot in trauma. And actually, that isn't to say that we should feel despondent about where we are now, even when we think about the extent to which we're free to create our own narratives now. I think actually it's bearing all these things in mind that gives rise to the power that we have to create from a space of joy and to create from a space of our personal experiences. I'm thinking a bit about my generation, my identity. My parents are from Jamaica. I have a Jamaican background. I was born here in England, and all of these things intersect. There's so much that I carry from my parents and my culture in regards to wellness and the attitudes that I have to carry as I bring myself through this world, how I approach injustice, how I approach relaxation, how I prioritize myself. There is so much there that I've taken from my parents and my family and where I'm from, and these are the things that I prioritize as centering in the work and the stories that I tell. So I guess circling back to the initial question that I posed in this section, which is that who decides the stories that we tell in visual art at the moment? And I'm hoping that to a certain extent we do at the moment. So now we think about the idea of self-soothing. So this idea of, I've touched on it just now, but it's this idea of prioritising our own well-being and creating the work that makes us feel seen, it makes us feel well and makes us feel seen. I think that we reserve the right to put ourselves first and to create work that not only we enjoy, but work that allows us to be visible in this industry. And when I was thinking through this point and thinking through this idea of prioritising us, I thought about the idea of for us by us. And that phrase is self-explanatory, the idea of creating something for us and by us as opposed to anyone else. But it also led me to thinking back to the FUBU sportswear brand that was founded in the 1992 that all the cool kids wore. And this brand, there's a massive story actually behind the FUBU brand. And there's I'll just reference it quickly, but there is a interview that I'll put in the reference list where the founder talks about this brand that he created, and he talks about what it did for his community, but also what it did for him. And I guess all of that is to say that our creative output, the work that we are creating, is powerful and it's a form of activism within itself, but it has to serve us as individuals before it can work as activism for anyone else. It has to serve us before it can work for anyone else. I've put another keyword here, I've dropped another keyword of mental health literacy here. So mental health history is literacy, is another clinical term. It's a term that we use in mental health, and it looks at our understanding of how to obtain but also how to maintain positive mental health. So it's looking at understanding mental health problems and what we can do to help ourselves and support ourselves. It looks at decreasing stigma, but it also looks at the encouraging of help seeking. And this is really important because having mental health literacy not only means understanding all of those things, but it means having the words, having the ability to say and have the vocabulary around positive mental health and what it is that you need to feel well. And if we're thinking about creating work, creating our illustrations from a place of wellness and a place of recovery, then we need to have the mental health literacy around what it is that we need for ourselves, how we can pour into ourselves in order to sustain our presence here, to sustain our ability to keep making work. And this idea of mental health literacy comes up so much in my mental health work as a mental health advisor, because it's something I'm always encouraging people to do. It's something I'm always encouraging students to do, which is to develop the vocabulary around your needs, your mental health needs and your wellness needs, so that you are in a position to talk about what it is that you want for yourself and for your wellness, but then so that you're in a position to use that knowledge and that literacy to form the basis for your illustration and for your creative work. It's important to note that if it isn't something that you even give the space to talk about, it isn't something that you can use as central to your illustration and to your work. So mental health literacy comes hand in hand in prioritizing your well-being and understanding what it is that you need so that you can depict this joy and this wellness in your work. As a I've spoken a bit about how that comes up in my role as a mental health advisor, but I would argue that as an illustrator and as an educator, these things are just important because these are the things that form the foundation of your work. And I guess this is the kind of thing that you should be asking yourself: how does this knowledge apply to my illustration? How does it form the foundation of my creative practice and my creative work? And I guess as an extension of that, to take that one step further, how does that support my own recovery? Okay, so the last way that I am thinking through how we can use illustration is how we can use illustration to share aspiration, how we can use our imagination. Our illustration, all of our creative work, regardless of what medium you use, is rooted in our imagination. It's our imagination that creates a space where we can create. And if we really kind of zone in on our imagination and how much this can open up possibility and opportunity to create from a space of repair, rest and recovery. Creating works on social justice and activism and radicalism isn't just about depicting trauma or depicting injustice, depicting inequality. It is just as radical, I would say, to depict rest and wellness in our work. And I'm thinking a lot about my own identity when I think about this, because there's a really complex kind of historical relationship between Black women and rest. There's so much there, and there's so much to talk about in regards to this. And for me, my existence in this space feels like enough. It feels like activism enough. Just being here and being able to take up space in the industries that I take up space in is activism enough. My presence is activism enough. And actually, this isn't something that I have to... The way to tell that story and to show my activism isn't just to give rise to stories of trauma, but actually to depict myself and Black women in a place of peace. So all of the work, as you know, that I create is drawing on softness and rest. And for me, this is owning my own narrative. It's telling the kind of stories that I want to tell, and it's representing the various sides of me, and by extension my community, that for years I feel hasn't been prioritised, it hasn't been told. It's radical to depict our wellness and to depict our rest and ability to rest and be at peace, as well as to depict the trauma that has come from years and years and years of history. There's a quote from Audre Lorde that really stands out here. It's a really well-known quote that I'm sure all of us have heard in some iteration. And she says that caring for myself is not just self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that within itself is an act of political warfare. And that was from her book, Burst of Light, that was published in '88. It's a collection of various essays that she looks at this idea of caring for herself and putting herself first. And especially this year, if we think about the year that we have had, the year heading up to 2 that we've had, and I'm thinking of course about the pandemic, but I'm also thinking about the spotlight that came on social justice and racial inequality last year that was extremely exposing and exhausting for people of colour everywhere. We are living in such a difficult time right now as we're experiencing all of this from home, often working and living in the same space, and often working a bit more, working from home. Anecdotally, a lot of my colleagues and I have spoken about how much more we're working because we're at home and we're not commuting and we're not having the time to kind of physically take a break, go out, socialise, see friends. So we're actually working a lot more. and prioritizing rest and using our illustration and creative space as an aspirational space to draw, to physically draw this space of recovery and this space of care, and repair is massive, and it's something that we can do for ourselves, but also something that is aspirational to those that feel unseen, or aspirational to those that don't feel like they yet have the ability to be in a space of rest and recovery. I think that the classroom is a great space for using the imagination. I think that imagination should be encouraged in the classroom, and it feels like the perfect opportunity to dream up all of the wildest things that we can possibly imagine happen in reality, and to use that space to physically draw through our illustration and through our creative practice, a space where not only is recovery possible, but it's accessible to everyone. And there's so much more, I think, that we can think about together there when we think about kind of fantasy and mystical themes in illustration and work, where we are physically drawing worlds and environments that are impossible. And I think that rest and recovery really lends itself well to creating from a space of aspiration. The reference here, the example I have here, is from an illustrator, well, a multidisciplinary artist again, Charlotte Eady. She's an illustrator, she's a textile designer. This here is a tapestry titled Repair, actually, really appropriately, where she speaks about restoration, and she speaks to themes of fragility and actually the short-term solutions around care and rest and relaxation. And she often taps into kind of magical, mystical scenes that aren't often based in reality, but are speaking to themes of rest that are centered in reality. And I think there's so much opportunity there for us to explore these themes and think about how that might apply to our work. So what does this mean? What does this mean? What has everything I've said kind of meant for us? I guess just to summarise, my position is that illustrators have a really unique opportunity to encourage recovery and wellness in the work that they create. It's something that I do, and it's something that I think a lot more illustrators can do as we create. We can use our work to kind of illustrate hope and to illustrate peace, but also to give rise to our own truth, and to decide what narratives it is that we want to tell and that we want to share with the world. I think that to be in a position to do this, you have to understand your own intersectionality, and I think it's important to ask yourself directly how this can come through in your work. So I've laid out 4 questions here that kind of rise from all the ways that I've described my approach to work that I've just covered with you. And these are questions that I pose that you ask yourself as you kind of work out what everything I've said means and work out kind of what it means for you. And actually, if journaling or free writing is something that you do, doodling, stimming, if these are the kind of things that you kind of feel comfortable to do, these questions might be the perfect opportunity to use those as prompts or guides to then reflect on what your answers are to these questions. The first question is, am I documenting my reality as evidence of where I am in history as it unfolds, as we think about where we are now and the magnitude of things that are happening? If we think about our 2020 alone and just how much that is going to go down in history, how are we documenting our reality today? How are we kind of using that as evidence of what we are representing right now? Am I boldly reclaiming the narratives that surround me, especially the narratives that aren't told enough? If we think about what kind of narratives in my family, in my culture, in my history, in my rituals, what narratives that are rooted in recovery and wellness are not actually told as often as they could? What are the things that I really enjoy and that I really revel in that I don't feel I see enough in illustration? And am I reclaiming those narratives? Am I taking those as my own, bearing my own intersectionality into consideration? Is my work self-soothing? Is it encouraging my own wellness? And is it something that you can use to form maybe your own mindful kind of practice in your illustration? I didn't talk as much, I didn't have as much time to tell you a bit about how my creative practice kind of got to where it is and why I approach my work the way I do. That is a whole other story for another day. But ultimately, kind of spoiler alert, it's a mindfulness practice for me. My illustration started as a way to include mindfulness in my day, and I encourage us to think about how your work can self-soothe you and how it can encourage your own wellness. And the last question, and potentially the most important question, is am I using my work to prioritise recovery and repair? And of course, to answer that question, you have to think about how recovery and repair applies to you, what that means to you anyway, and then think about how your work could prioritise that. And I guess the last question to kind of bring all those things together is how do you plan to bring this with you into your creative practice going forward? How do you plan to not only answer these questions, but reflect on some of the references and points that I've raised and apply that to your work going forward? I think often when we think through the possibilities for our work and for our creative practice, and ideas come up, it can be quite difficult to hold yourself accountable and work out how do I start to apply this to the work that I create going forward. So I would propose potentially making a bit of a plan. I know that in the workshop that we do on Friday, I will spend some time kind of planning. I am a planner, so thinking a bit about how we can plan for our creative work going forward and maybe how we can answer these questions. These questions and the references I've spoken about today will form a central part of that workshop. And I'd encourage, whether you come to the workshop or not, to think about how you might apply some of these themes on recovery and repair, how you might apply that to your illustration and your work going forward. So lastly, of course, I would welcome you to stay in touch. Please do email if there's any questions that you have. I am quite chatty, I'm quite talkative, so I usually really enjoy sessions where we can talk live and engage in this kind of content and you can ask questions. So in lieu of that, as we kind of adapt to the kind of current learning kind of environment that we're in, I would encourage any questions or thoughts or commentary that you have, do email it across. My kind of professional website, but also the Line and Honey website is also here, and our Instagram. So please do have a look, let me know thoughts, and of course, if you are interested in thinking about this further, as I said, attend the workshop or look through the references that I will send out that will kind of give you a few starting points for further reading if this is the kind of thing that is interesting for you. Thank you.